We actually sang that meditation song frequently during times of challenge and debate at this year's Unitarian Universalist General Assembly. It helped us ground and get back to a place of love and peace. And it was actually written by a board member of the Unitarian Universalist Association, so she was there to lead us in it, which made it particularly special. Fittingly, resist and rejoice was the theme of the week as about 4,000 UUs from all around the world gathered. Every year we come together, as many of you know, in late June for our annual assembly as a faith, to discuss Unitarian Universalism on a national level and discern the future direction for our faith. This year, GA, as it's known, took place in sultry New Orleans. I still have trouble pronouncing that properly, but New Orleans, I would say, but New Orleans, I think is how you're supposed to say it. A colorful city with a fascinating, beautiful, and troubled past that laid the perfect foundation for the theme of resisting and rejoicing. Now, as you can imagine, there was plenty of rejoicing, with extraordinary New Orleans jazz, singing, dancing, and sumptuous food at every corner. And there was a lot of learning about how we might better resist the current happenings, both in our country and in our faith. It all took place against a hot and humid background of tropical storms, sudden deluges, and tornado warnings. It was an adventure. This year we were called to a different kind of General Assembly in which we would deeply explore how our UU faith could become less Eurocentric with majority white people and more inclusive of economic, racial, cultural, and educational diversity. Now, multiculturalism is something we've been aspiring to as a faith for a long time. It's part of our deepest values of inclusivity and welcoming. But this spring, amidst controversy about hiring yet another white male for a top leadership position, our UU Association began a deeper inquiry. The UUA had to examine in earnest how a culture of white supremacy in our country may also be reflected in our faith. Surprising, right? It hasn't been easy. But it's now become a priority for our wider movement to examine how we might dismantle centuries of unconscious bias and business as usual to become faith leaders in inclusivity, anti-racism, and power sharing. Now, for those of you who weren't here for our systemic racism service on Memorial Day, the term white supremacy may feel rather jarring. It may conjure images of neo-Nazis waving Confederate flags. And it certainly doesn't resonate as something most people here in our pews ascribe to or identify with. The term is actually being repurposed with the hope that it will bring greater awareness to what our culture feels like to many people of color. During the Systemic Racism service, we explored the impact of living in a national culture which advantages whiteness on all levels. It lies in the undercurrents of our educational system, our government, our policing, our immigration, and prison systems. Our UU faith is committed to examining these unconscious patterns in our society and try, at very least, to dismantle such hierarchies and oppressions within our own denomination. This work of countering white supremacy began with appointing 3 co-presidents of color to lead our faith after our president of almost 8 years, Peter Morales, and other leaders resigned in early April. It continued with a nationwide call for a teach-in on white supremacy and systemic racism, which over 700 of our congregations nationwide embraced. And it proceeded further at this General Assembly by throwing out business as usual, while new paradigms of leadership and doing business were explored. Although many people, including me, went into this General Assembly with concern that there might be conflict, what emerged was an assembly that was heartfelt, experimental, healing, and deeply moving. It was led with great sensitivity and skill, mostly by people of color, and it was transformational for our movement. I encourage you to go to uua.org and watch videos of any of the general sessions from GA, particularly the daily talks by our 3 interim co-presidents, which were powerful, thoughtful, and enlightening, and set a beautiful vision for the future. They helped people understand the urgent need for transformation and what that might look like, so we could be a relevant faith going forward. And they also appointed a commission on institutional change to examine and promote this necessary cultural shift. Reverend Bill Sinkford, one of the co-presidents, said, "Change must come if our faith is to thrive. It is our culture and not our theology that has been our biggest obstacle. There is a fundamental hope," he writes, "in our values and our aspirations that speaks to persons across the boundaries of race and culture and language and economic circumstance and ability." It is this hope of a faith that reaches across boundaries of race, class, ethnicity, economics, gender, and abilities that we aspire to inhabit more deeply. Can I hear an amen on that? Amen. We aspire to dismantle, piece by piece, systems of oppression that infuse our culture, but also seep into our beloved faith. Racial justice work, my friends, is spiritual development. By striving to do the difficult work of reparation, healing, and humility, we grow spiritually. It's also visionary and aspirational as we try to live into Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s call for beloved community as our core spiritual practice. If we can seriously commit to this work of dismantling racism and growing beloved community in our faith, we have an opportunity to be leaders in the nonviolent movement towards racial justice and partnership, true partnership in our country. Other denominations are watching as we navigate this. The 5 days of General Assembly offered workshops and discussions with nationally respected leaders, all in an effort to examine our faith and make decisions about our future direction. And the Assembly included electing a new president of the association. Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, an accomplished and highly qualified minister from the Phoenix congregation, some of you know her, and she's also a good friend of mine, became our first elected white woman president and has begun her 6-year term at the UUA. I know, our first elected woman president. In a moment, you'll be hearing personal stories of what impacted some of our congregants at General Assembly. And I'm delighted to say we had 12 members of our congregation go to New Orleans and attend GA. And that's about 6% of our congregation, so great showing, CVUUF. I think we were one of the congregations with the biggest showing that had come that far, so that was great. But first I wanted to give you a brief overview of the main business that was concluded at the Assembly, because that's its main purpose. The Assembly passed a request for a bylaw amendment, which would change the language of our second source, which you'll see on the back of your order of service. If you all turn to the back of the order of service, the second one talks about the words and deeds of prophetic women and men. And we voted to change women and men to people.
Yes.
Yes. Though this was passed by more than 2/3 vote, our bylaws require it to be finalized in a future General Assembly before we can change it in all our materials, but I firmly believe we're heading that way. Again, a question of greater inclusivity. And then there was a statement of conscience addressing nationwide escalating inequality, which was passed. And the UUA board and staff were asked to help coordinate and strategize and advise congregations on how to actually address issues of escalating inequality. And Michael Teasdale is going to share shortly more about that process because he's been at the forefront of that movement. And then a responsive resolution was passed to change the words of our national campaign and hymn, which you'll see here, Standing on the Side of Love, to language that is more inclusive and just towards people with differently abled physical capacities. So the composer of the hymn, Standing on the Side of Love, Reverend Jason Shelton, responded to this call for inclusivity by officially changing the words to the hymn to Answering the Call of Love. Answering the Call of Love. And it actually felt quite comfortable singing the new words after a while. And we're going to start using them here too once our music director, Joel, returns from vacation. So work that into your vocabulary. Answering the Call of Love. Additionally, am I going to have to get a new stole? That's a good question. The Standing on the Love Side campaign is going to look at repurposing all their materials. So our yellow T-shirts with Standing on the Side of Love may become special relics, but we'll see. We'll see how that unfolds. Additionally, there was an overwhelming resolution to appoint a study commission to consider adding an 8th principle to our 7 UU principles. And you can see our 7 principles, for those of you who aren't familiar, inside of our order of service. And we've had 7 principles since the early 1980s. And we're now looking at proposing this 8th principle, which is tentatively stated as, we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by building a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Thank you. The Commission is going to share their findings, and we're going to vote on it at next year's General Assembly. So if you can, do come. If you've never been to a General Assembly, I encourage you to attend. It provides a completely different understanding of Unitarian Universalism. It offers incredible, vibrant worship services and engaging workshops. And it helps you feel part of a much larger movement when you sing with 4,000 other voices, can you imagine? And you meet people from congregations all over the world. And you see hundreds of youth avidly embracing our faith and working towards its future. Next year it's going to take place in Kansas, right in the middle of the country. And the following year it'll be in Spokane, Washington, so on the West Coast. So make that a part of your plans. It's always like the 3rd week in June. So today we want to offer you a flavor of GA and New Orleans with a few members sharing what lessons they learned or what touched them most deeply. And after hearing about GA and the priorities of our faith, I ask you how you want to live out this beautiful, loving faith of ours. I invite us to keep wrestling with these issues and prioritize building multicultural community within these walls and beyond. Ask yourself, what will you do to create transformation within our movement and beyond? To close, I share the invitation of Olympia Brown, who was our first female Universalist minister in the mid-1800s. She writes, "Dear friends, stand by this faith, work for it, and sacrifice for it. There is nothing in the world so important as to be loyal to this faith which has placed before you the loftiest ideals, which has comforted you in sorrow, which has strengthened you for noble duty and made the world beautiful for you. Do not demand immediate results, but rejoice that you are worthy to be entrusted with this great message, and that you are strong enough to work for a great true principle without counting the cost. May it be so. And I now invite Todd Hess to come up and share his experience.
I love worship at GA. The sermons and lectures represent each speaker's peak performance for the year. Having that focus on making a more just world by addressing institutional racism, white supremacy, felt immediate and relevant in ways I can act. Two particularly moved me. I felt Reverend Cheryl Walker at the service of the living tradition speaking directly to me when I too often want attention instead of results. She declared, "I'm not in this to make a name. I'm in this to make a difference." And Brian Stevenson delivered in his Where lecture a high-level action plan. Be proximate. Change the narrative. Stay hopeful. Do uncomfortable things. That first goal, be proximate, is a specific instant of the last one, to do uncomfortable things. Yet it makes sense of where we need to start, by showing up close and personal. More than the words from the podium, though, my favorite moments were one-on-one conversations. One small but important example from those conversations: when hearing about my son-in-law, Felicien, hailing from and working now in Cameroon, Leon Spencer, one of the co-presidents, shared with me that he has Cameroonian roots. We are more connected than any of us would guess. I rely on my faith, my Unitarian Universalism, to guide me to be the best person I can be. And that best person right now is one who desperately wants to be the grandfather Rockland needs, the father and father-in-law that Megan and Felicien need. I left GA with a growing understanding for white supremacy. I was encouraged that my church and my denomination will keep striving for a better world with more love. I went to GA with a declaration to Lorella: we will leave GA with a new president and renewed faith. We are anchor believers in moving towards a world in which Rockland will thrive. GA delivered.
That's a tough act to follow. I have a confession. I haven't always been a UU. As a matter of fact, I rejected my first opportunity to be a UU. When I moved from Berlin, Germany to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, I looked for a church for my children. And I decided against a UU option because UUs sent their children out. Wouldn't it have been nice if Rockland could have heard that just now? And I wanted to worship with my children, so I chose an Episcopal church. And this was on the border of the campus. It was known for its social justice activism. And I went into it and was told this is not a normal time for this church. They had just uncovered a huge embezzlement of funds by their trusted business manager, and they were groping with how to live with their values of forgiveness, recognizing their neglect of stewardship, and realizing they also needed to serve justice and press charges against this member of their congregation. And I learned that it's a time like this when you see the true nature of a church, just like it's the time of duress when you learn the true nature of people. The past few months in UU history have certainly been a time of duress. And reflecting that 2017 GA was not a normal GA, as you heard. It was not a typical fun-loving, joyful, wonderful celebration with pomp and circumstance of who we are and how wonderful we are. It was not this delight in being with like-minded people and the rest of the world being disconnected. This GA was clearly in the midst of shock, pain, fresh pain, soul-searching, but also a pulling together and an examining of how we can live the broader values of Unitarian Universalism. And it was an opportunity, as you heard, for growth, for reconciliation. It was, in fact, amazing, powerful, and quite wonderful. Not that attending GA was easy. Oh yeah, there was tremendous joy in the celebrations, the protests, the seeing old friends, the fresh crop of young UUs and looking to their future and their impact on this faith. It was being in a like community of loving people with common aspirations, and as you heard, the singing is amazing. Everyone lifting up voices in songs that we know, sharing old favorites, and singing newly minted new favorites, which I hope we'll be hearing here as well. It was like having wings and flying, that part of it was, but it was also tough. It was like being thrown in a crucible, like being broken apart, like being melted down. Truly, my experience minute by minute there was through the sermons, through the discussions, I felt like I was sandblasted. I felt like I was confronted where my vision was narrow, noting where I could reach for greater wisdom, for a bigger mind, and noting the crumbling of beliefs I thought were a part of me was part of this GA for me. I was developing new sensitivities and compassion and what I like to seek in my meditation practice, big heart. Well, I learned so many things, much of it about what I take for granted in our society, about how the streets are paved for me, about where others walk tenderly on hot coals and cut glass I can tread with comfort. I learned from Bill Singford that efficiency, which something I have prided, I have learned to value. It was part of my professional life. It's not a virtue. From Linda Sarsour, this amazing woman who was honored at the UUSC, the Muslim coordinator of the Women's March on Washington, I was reminded of the tremendous value of partnerships. And from Brian Stevenson, who has been lifted up a number of times today already, what I held most strongly was him reminding me of the importance of hope. The hope that I can change, the hope that the people around me can change, that each and every one of us, regardless of how hardened we are, can open up to new ways of living and loving. And then I learned that there is our faith, which brought me to UU, which is constant and beautiful and inclusive, but it is entirely separate from our practice. Practice differs from church to church, from fellowship to fellowship. And it's the practice that has been bogged down, it's been stuck, it's been resistant of change and finding comfort in an old way of doing things. The comfort of the familiar over the discomfort of change, which is also something Brian Stevenson brought up. We have to move to discomfort. And it's the practice that we can change. And we must change to be more inclusive and live more closely our values. Well, being a GA and being Meltdown was perhaps a bit like feeling like the Damascus knife I got from my birthday from my beloved husband, layered and strengthened and honed and sharpened and changed in a powerful way that I hope to hold on to. I'm moved by Olympia Brown's words that we are to stand by, work for, and sacrifice for this faith. It is work that I hope I will continue to do. But for those of you who want an easier path, I found an alternative in New Orleans. This church really makes it easy. The church that will heal you, save your soul, and even die for you. Thanks for your attention.
Good morning. My name is Michael Teasdale. I too had a very rich time at the GA, and I took away a couple things that I hope to share with you this morning. The first is, as Reverend Nica mentioned, was the passage of the Statement of Conscience. And it was, for me, after a long history of subgroups, task forces, and many types of initiatives, UUs have really taken a stand on inequality. The SOC states unequivocally that the current economic inequality and its growing nature is really against our values and contradicts what we are. The rising income inequality and wealth inequality undermines our democracy, exasperates racism, and also worsens the tendency towards polarization. You know, the cultural differences we have, the religious differences, and the socioeconomic differences that we're now experiencing. So it's it's a very eloquent document. It's also a very inspiring call to action. It contains many specific proposals in which individuals or congregations can act to address the growing inequality. I urge you all to take 20 minutes, read it. It's online at uua.org. Go to that site, put in Statement of Conscience, and it will pop up. And find something that resonates with you, because inequality is something that permeates our culture now and affects everything. And there's a long list. In fact, one of the criticisms of the statement is that there's too long a list of actions, so you have plenty to choose from. You can also, here in our congregation, join us at the last Monday of each month. We have a group on growing inequality. We do a great job discussing articles, sometimes venting, sometimes having jokes, but we also get involved in actions. The last action we had was to visit Jackie Irwin, our assembly person in Sacramento, about universal health care. And we had a great meeting with her. In fact, we'll have a series of other meetings to help educate the public with her sponsorship. So it's really something exciting. So the first thing was that Statement of Conscience. I thought that was great that officially UUs took a stand on that. The second was during the process of getting feedback for the Statement of Conscience that really stuck with me. There were a number of meetings in the GA, and during the meeting that I was in, there was a big discussion about, how should we word the Statement of Conscience? And very quickly, the discussion became really a sort of dialogue between the black folk in the meeting and the white folk about white supremacism and capitalism. And the tension as that language came about was just really palpable. It was very difficult, I think, for us to understand one another and to really listen. Even with the best of intentions, the dialogue became something that was very stilted and very cautious. When I walked away from that meeting, I really realized that, we live in bubbles. We have a tendency to frequent people who look like us, have the same economic status as we do, have the same religion. And I think a challenge that we should all take, here in our congregation is how can we reach out to people who do think differently from us, evangelicals, or do have a different race or socioeconomic level than us, and how can we try to engender a dialogue with them? How can we learn to build better relationships of trust and understanding so we can really talk to one another and understand one another? I think that's our big challenge. And to go back to the children's story that Elizabeth wrote, I think we need to put our skin in the game and really sort of reach out to other people in our community that are different from us. in a way we can get that understanding. That was my second big takeaway, and hopefully we'll be doing something about that this year. Thank you.
Well, I'd grown up in the South, and I'd seen a lot of big houses with Southern decorations and racist ornamentations, like that stone statue of that little black lawn jockey that you were supposed to tie your horse to, even though no one rode horses anymore. I'd never seen a plantation. Leaving New Orleans, we traveled to the country to see a locality called the Whitney Plantation. It was a place where the sugar cane was raised to sweeten the lives of European royalty, the 1% of society, to drink their sugary coffee and sweet tea on the backs of generations of enslaved African nations, dragged in chains in pain across the sea to work in the hot and sticky infested swamps of Louisiana. It would not be a long stay for all who obeyed and worked in the fields, no matter the age of the enslaved, 10 years to the grave. You'd be dead in a decade no matter how you behaved. Everyone died from the strain of working the cane. White plantation owners only concerned about endurance for 6 months, when insurance would cover the cost of buying another person to replace the dying. The value of purchased people was greater than the value of the land and the steeple and the great mansions that stood upon it. You weren't allowed to learn to read. You weren't allowed to write. You weren't allowed your family, your culture, your religion, or any basic rights. Even your name was taken to make you more compliant, make you easier to rule over, less defiant. Stripped naked of all that had meaning, taught only the parts of the Bible that encouraged subservience as redeeming. You see, even a revolution that produced the Constitution called you 3/5 of a man. How African Americans have triumphed over a concentration camp inheritance that lasted centuries and continues unofficially, systemically, is beyond me. Nothing was left to the imagination at the Whitney Plantation.